And I'm so glad you brought up the 50-50 thing because that is definitely a barrier for a lot of folks.
I think it's a really unique experience because you're not straight enough for the straights
Mhm.
and you're not gay enough for the gays.
Ah,
Hello and welcome to Closeted History, the podcast where we out the queer and trans history that you never knew. My name is Destiny. I use she, they pronouns. And today I am joined by Rebecca Miner, a licensed therapist, educator, and advocate passionate about creating affirming spaces for LGBTQ plus folks. Rebecca is one of the founders of Bi Invisibility, a platform that centers the experiences of bisexual individuals, an often overlooked group within the LGBTQ plus community, despite making up the majority. In fact, studies show that bisexual adults represent 57.3% of LGBTQ plus adults in the US, yet their voices are frequently erased or misunderstood. Through Bi Invisibility, Rebecca is working to change that. Thank you so much for being on the show.
thank you
Welcome.
so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to finally connect. So, what inspired you to create Bi Invisibility?
So, I had had an active social media presence for a number of years as a therapist, and the rules around being being a therapist are often ones of privacy and boundaries. And so, I had been careful to not share much about my personal life. And I realized in doing so, I built a persona of a queer person without clarifying that I was also partnered to a cis man. And it wasn't until I started getting more questions from folks who were like, I'm wondering about this for myself, but I don't know anyone who is married to a man and is also exploring their identity. And I was like, oh shoot, like I'm not modeling the reality of my life and also not modeling this possibility for folks.
Hmm.
And so for Pride, not this past year, but the year before, I made a reel that was like, surprise, surprise, I'm, queer and also married to a man. And it blew up. And like so many people commented on it, being like, oh my God, me too. I thought it was just me. And like even famous people commented on it. And so I was like, oh wow, okay, this is really a thing. And I had been talking to Meg O'Neill, who I started the group with over DMs, and she was going through this exploration process for herself. And we started talking about what it would look like to just have like a one off, like a pop up chat. For the time, it ended up being mostly women who were married to cis men, while
Hmm.
also exploring their identity. And then it blossomed from there.
Yeah, I do actually remember when you made that reel, because you and I have been internet pals for a little bit, and through your work, through your therapy work, that like I saw that reel, and it's been really awesome to kind of see it grow and also feel represented by it, because
Yeah.
I'm also a bi person in a cis passing straight heteronormative
Mhm.
relationship, and it's really tough to navigate that space, kind of feeling not queer enough. Is that like a challenge or something that people share within your community that you've built?
People talk about not feeling queer enough a lot, because a good portion of the folks who are part of our community are sometimes who came out later in life. And so some of them figured this out, 10 years into their marriage or years after having children. And so they haven't been able to kind of act on any of that, or explore it in a way that I think, unfortunately, often feels like is what's needed to legitimize one's identity, though it is not. So there's often some imposter syndrome and a sense that, like, how can I claim this if I'm married to a man and I've never actually had any of these experiences? But it's something that I'm like realizing about myself.
Yeah, and that's kind of a good segue into asking about what are some of the misconceptions or some of those myths about being bisexual that you see not only coming up as like an internalized experience, but in the world, we also have those misconceptions. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. I think The one that comes to mind immediately is about promiscuity and the like very hypersexual focus around the identity, when in fact, especially for folks in our community, it often doesn't change a thing about their life or their relationship. And but the word sexual is in the name, right? So it's kind of hard to move away from that. So I think there's internalized beliefs around what one should have done, and there's also kind of outside expectations or thoughts that like, oh, if you come out as bisexual, that means like you're just trying to get attention, or you can't pick a side, or you just want to hook up with everyone. The list goes on. But I think the idea that, um, especially for folks who are like, I'm in my 40s and I have kids and like I'm not trying to be non-monogamous. Some folks in the group are, and that's great. But for folks who are like, I actually don't want all that much in my life to change, besides the fact that it feels important to me to acknowledge this part of my identity and also have my spouse or my community know this about me too. But there's so much fear around like what that will mean when it's shared, and the assumptions that people will make about their current relationship. Like, are you leaving your husband or your wife or your whomever? Or like, what about your kids? And it's like, this actually doesn't have to change anything. It's just like,
Right.
I'm getting to know myself and I'm letting you into that too.
I love that. I actually saw a video that you posted on your Instagram page that was like a guy talking about being a bisexual, and that, even if it's 1%.
I don't think sexuality is 50-50. If I sleep with men 5% of the time and I'm attracted to men, I think that qualifies me for being bi. But, it doesn't mean I'm going to run off and everybody I ever meet.
You can still honor that space for yourself. That, most people, like, going back to those misconceptions that a lot of people think, like, oh, it has to be 50-50.
50-50.
And, attraction, there are all kinds of attraction. And it's can be very fluid. And, one day you're like 80% for women or
Mhm.
20% for men. And then, years down the line, it changes. And so can you talk more about that misconception and how that kind of shows up for folks within your community?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up the 50-50 thing, because that is definitely a barrier for a lot of folks. I think to really be able to claim the identity. Because the thought is like, if I find a few people of a certain gender attractive, but am like consistently attracted to folks of another gender, is that enough for me to kind of qualify? And then I think educating people around the idea that there are many types of attraction, right? There can be sexual attraction, romantic attraction, aesthetic attraction, that you might be romantically attracted to people of a certain gender, but not sexually attracted, or, that can be a sliding scale that is fluid and shifts and changes over the course of your lifespan. So, um, you know, I think that's another thing that comes up for people is like, was I lying to myself or was I lying to my spouse when we got married and I made this promise and I didn't
Mhm.
tell them this was something I felt? And it's like, well, no, because you also maybe weren't conscious of it. And that kind of automatically brings people into starting to learn more about compulsory heterosexuality.
Yes, yes, that was gonna be my next question of, like, how is that kind of addressed or talked about within the community that you've built?
We talk about it a lot.
Mhm.
And in our Discord, there's a lot of information sharing. And, that started probably with the lesbian master doc. Um, that was a real wake up call for a lot of folks. But some people consistently, like it feels like every time I bring it up, I'm like blowing someone's mind, even though I'm like, this is not new. I did not make it up. Like, I do not take ownership over this concept. But I think generationally, that's something that's been really interesting in the group, is the difference of like working with my teen clients who, as a therapist, who are like, oh, I'm poly and I'm also demi this and that. And they have like 12 different identities that are very nuanced. Whereas the like 40 something year old folks in our group are like queer was a bad word, and I'm not sure if it's like okay for me to claim that or feel that. We talk about language a lot too. It's funny because I actually don't use the word bisexual to describe myself, but when we were coming up with the name for the group, because initially it was called Bi Wife Energy because of the that sound bite that was so popular. But
Mm-hmm.
then I was like, this is limiting who our audience is. And I really wanted to make the space open to people of all genders and identities. So we were moving towards like something that didn't have wife in the title, because also not everyone identifies with that language. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but when I suggested anything queer, a lot of folks who were already in the group were like, no, 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 I wouldn't sign up for that. Like that's too gay. Um,
That's where you draw the line at queer.
so that was so interesting to me because I was like, oh, huh. Like, but the word bi made it feel accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's what we went with. And I do think it has made it more accessible to folks. Obviously, it's picked up like wildfire in a way that I never anticipated. Um,
Yeah, you're like approaching 100K
I know.
on Instagram and
It's
have
wild.
yeah.
It's really wild. And I think I continually am like in awe of that, and also remind everyone in the group that like when you feel like you are alone in this experience, like you aren't. And we have numbers to prove that.
I wanted to go back to what you said that bi felt accessible. Cuz you know, for myself that like bi is usually the language that I use if you know you're very early in the journey or maybe not part of the community, just mostly to signify that I'm not straight.
Yep.
Because I more so identify with pansexual,
Mhm.
but I use them interchangeably because, again, you know, bisexual to me just is like, hey, I'm not straight. I like people of multiple genders,
Yes.
and pansexual. You know, I didn't even know that was an identity at all until much later. And I've always known that I was queer since I was like you know, 7 or 8, but I didn't come out to my parents and to, you know, the community around me until I was in my 20s.
Mhm.
And I was at the time married to a man, and it was, you know, like, "Oh, okay, cool. Does he know?" And I'm like,
Right.
"Oh, well, yes."
Yep.
And, you know, but since then, left that relationship and, you know, I had to have like a really hard conversation with my mom and with my dad that like, hey, the next partner might
Might
not
not.
be what you're expecting. So I think that, like you said, you know, that we're not alone. And I think that maybe people might have kind of similar relationships to the word bisexual, that it feels very accessible to them. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that, and that I love that, you know, you kind of saw it that way for your community as well.
Yeah, and I think it's proven true, and I've witnessed people who've now been in the group for like a year starting to be like, maybe I use pan, maybe I use queer," and I'm like, "Right, yep, okay, take your time, do you, like whatever language works."
Queer can just be easier because, like, I'm also gender queer. I'm
Mhm.
non-binary, and so just queer just does
Well,
it all for me.
and that's why I love the term queer, and it's that's been another thing that's been interesting to witness in the group is how many people have started to unpack some of their orientation that then have also been like, what about gender?"
Yep.
And so we have a separate channel for that. We have a like gender exploration channel, but also a trans and non-binary channel. And it's been really interesting. And especially to see how many folks in the men's channel frequent
Mhm.
those other channels as well.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, what have been some, like, challenges that you faced in creating and kinda maintaining that space? Like you said, you know, it's growing a lot, you're approaching 100K. What are some of those challenges that you've faced in building that?
I mean, there's the like very basic logistical challenges of just like it's a lot more work than I had originally planned for.
Yeah.
And it was one thing when it was me and Meg, but then Meg decided to step back from running the community, not because she didn't love it, but just because life. And so suddenly it was like just me. So that was a little challenging as it's grown so rapidly. But I've been able to kind of get help from other folks who've been in the group now for a while. So we have some really great moderators in the Discord because I was like, I can't be here all day while I'm also seeing clients and also posting reels and also setting up these monthly calls. And just the back end stuff, I think, is a lot. And then there's the having a large presence on social media challenges of the like, for the most part, it's really positive, but I've had a couple posts where people have like really pushed back or had some really negative things to say. And that's just overwhelming kind of as a human to experience. I think I personally really struggle with feeling when I feel misunderstood.
Me too.
And and that's so hard on social media,
Yeah.
95,000 followers, like someone's going to be pissed no matter what you do. Like
Right.
you post one and I see other creators do this all the time. Like they post these silly memes that are like being bi is cuff jeans and whatever. And then if I'll post something like that and people will be like, how dare you minimize our community to something like this? Like you're telling me I don't belong. And I'm like, oh my God, I would never tell someone they don't belong.
Or
That's
like,
been a
just because
challenge.
you do that doesn't mean that you're bisexual.
Ugh,
Like,
yes.
okay, I get it, but also like, this is our community and you know, I mean, I with closeted history, like it's really challenging. I think that that's something that it's an experience that we all share
Yeah.
in, having to deal with kind of the moderation or their lack of
Hmm.
on social media. So I think it's really great that you're also building this platform and community for folks outside of social media
Yeah.
because it's becoming increasingly more important for us to lean into our communities outside of Instagram, Facebook, all of these apps that we all spend way too much time on.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I love to see that you're also creating that outside of social media. Do you think that you'll ever do any like in person
I would
events or
love to. I think that was something from the beginning that we were like, wouldn't that be so cool if we could do, actually the original idea was like, we should have a retreat. And then we were like, wait, before we have a retreat, we should have one meeting. Like, let's start and see if we even have an audience for this. But the
turns out you do?
turns out we do. And the
Yeah.
demand for in-person is growing, I think, as people really desire that connection. Um, and sometimes struggle to find in-person community that's affirming. A lot of folks in our group talk about not always feeling welcome in queer spaces, and especially if they're partnered um, to someone who, then they have a straight passing relationship that or straight presenting that um, they don't always feel like they're enough to attend certain things or be a part of different queer spaces and communities. So I would love for us to be able to do that. And it's just one of those another like logistical thing where I'm like, I need more of me to make some of that possible. But it is exciting to think about. And we do have a decent number of people in the New England area. So I've thought about even just doing like a smaller scale, like one day thing or something that isn't a retreat where people have to, pay lots of money and stay at a hotel and do all the things. But even just a smaller kind of gathering would be really nice. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'm hoping to do that in 2025.
All right. Well, we'll hold you to
All right.
it. Well, so since you mentioned that in the beginning, you were thinking like retreat, kind of getting people together in person, how has the work that you've done kind of evolved since its inception?
So it initially started off as just a single Zoom call. And then people were like, this was amazing. Can we do it again next month? So we were like, okay. So then the idea of a monthly call became a thing. And then people were really wanting to connect in between calls and have a place to share resources and again, like take some of that contact off of Instagram or social media. Um, and so that's when we evolved into the membership model of having like different options for people to either just be on Discord or if they want to attend the monthly meetings. Um, since then, we've had other people in the group want to create kind of like offshoot groups too, of like, we have a book club now, and it's very sweet. And there are a couple other, little groups forming for either different interests or different experiences that folks are sharing. Some people who have partners who are much more anxious about what this identity shift might mean for them or something are wanting to support each other. Folks who are exploring non-monogamy is another space. So I think that will kind of continue to grow as we move into next year. But yeah, it's definitely evolved, and it went from Discord with one chat channel to now we have like 30 channels. And I had to turn or like limit the notifications because it was like constant. Um,
Yeah.
but it's so beautiful to witness. Like I log on sometimes and I'm like, oh my God, look at these people supporting each other. Like they might live across the country, they might live across the world, right? We have it's international.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and which makes timing hard and a retreat kind of challenging. But yeah, it's really evolved and there's so much resource sharing and just really beautiful support.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the kind of subgroups within your community is folks who are in straight presenting relationships. Can you elaborate more on some of the challenges of being in a straight presenting relationship while exploring your queer identity?
Absolutely. I think that's really the bulk of our community. And I want anyone to feel like they can join. So I'm like, you don't have to be partnered to hang out with us. But there is a unique experience, I think, in either first recognizing this about yourself while also partnered, and feeling like your identity is therefore kind of invisible unless you really work hard at making it not so. And then for folks who, maybe have known this about themselves for a long time, but are still partnered to somebody who they love and are happy with.
Mm-hmm.
But because of how they visually present to the world, people just make assumptions about them and their partnership. So I think a lot of times it's an experience of just not feeling seen. There is so much, and it's hard to navigate too, because there's so much privilege in many ways in being in a relationship that appears as, straight presenting. And at the same time, there's also so much erasure. And so it's like, how can we hold both of these truths and not take away from anyone in the community, but also feel like it's okay for us to be a part of the community, regardless of who we're partnered with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really unique experience because you're not straight enough for the straights
Mhm.
and you're not gay enough for the gays.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, we don't want for folks to judge by, what we look like and how we present ourselves, but that, and you mentioned earlier that not all queer spaces are safe for every identity.
Mhm.
And that often people are just feel left out. And
Yes.
I think that is an experience that really not inherently comes with being bisexual, but that like you do feel really left out. I feel like, it's an experience that really resonates with a lot of bisexual folks, kind of having that duality of like,
Mhm.
the two worlds. And I think that also kind of feeds into those misconceptions of like, oh, it has to be 50-50. And so just kind of navigating that space, it's great to see that, there are folks who are in these straight presenting relationships, but that are still we're here, we're queer, and we're exploring our identities. It's
Absolutely.
good to see.
Yeah. And I think that is further complicated by gender too. I would say the majority of our community is made up of either cis women or folks assigned female at birth. Um, Many of whom have started, toying with gender a bit more, queering their concepts around gender since exploring their sexuality.
Hmm.
But there's a real lack of resources for bi men.
Yes.
Like, really, I've tried to look for things, and, like, when people reach out and are like, "This is what I'm going through. Do you have any recommended reading?" And I'm like, I have a few things," like, but there's really not much out there, and there's certainly not much out there about exploring your identity while in the context of a partnership, um, and especially one that's perceived as straight. Um, but so it's been really nice to create space for the men in our community. And so we do have a men's channel. I don't usually like to delineate things by gender, um, but it's felt important for them to have a space to talk about their experiences. And I know that their experiences do feel markedly different than some of the other folks in the group. Um, because they're complicated by ideas around masculinity and what is and isn't acceptable. And so you might have a wife, but what does it mean if you also fantasize about men, or even have acted on those fantasies? And can you still be a good father? And can you still be a good spouse? And obviously the answer is yes.
Yes.
But there's so much fear and shame. And so that's been a really I guess not surprising, but not an anticipated part of when we started this group, that
Hmm.
it's evolved into having some really, really sweet men's connection.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that like not just on like an individual level or within communities, but also on like a systemic level and legal level,
Yes.
like, some in some places bi men are barred from donating blood.
Mhm.
Of course, that's not fair. And we want to create space for that experience and let there be conversations around that. And that, you
Mhm.
know, I also don't like, the separation of like men and women, but I think that assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth do come with different experiences. And so it's really great to hear that you're creating space for that as well.
Yeah.
Can you share any like success stories from the community or maybe some rewarding feedback that you've gotten from your group?
Yeah, I mean, every time we meet, the chat is in the Zoom call is just like the most powerful testimonial anyone could ever ask for. It's just it blows me away every time that people are like, this group has changed my life. Like, I never expected to find a community like this. I love the stories of people coming back to the group and being like, I decided to come out to my husband, or like, I filled out a job application and checked off that I was bisexual for the first time. Just these things that might seem like small steps. I love the ones about people coming out to their kids, because usually their kids do not care and are like, "Mom, whatever, can you pass the potatoes?" So we have a lot of laughs together. I think, there is some heaviness and real feelings. And I think one of my favorite comments was from someone that was like, "I came to one of your meetings and then I just cried happy tears like the rest of the day."
I love that.
I know. Um, just, having found a place where it felt like I really belong here.
That's what it's all about,
Exactly.
we're floating on this strange rock in this really weird messed up timeline.
Yes.
So that's what it's about. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, how do you see kind of your role as a therapist and as an advocate for the LGBTQ plus community? How do you see those things, or excuse me, those roles informing each other, and how do they relate?
I don't think I could separate them if I wanted to even. I think the reality is that all of that is just a part of who I am, and has been like, and was how I was raised. So, I think I've never been quiet, or a bystander. And that's only, you know, that only furthers my commitment to my work in the therapy space, and also my understanding of how important it is for people to feel connected and belong, and to reduce shame, and to increase, a sense of self, and getting really clear about one's identity, like the benefits of all of that, then inform my advocacy work. So it's all pretty reciprocal.
Hmm.
Um, would be hard to tease apart.
Yeah. Well, what advice would you give someone who's struggling with their bi identity?
Well, I guess it depends on what the struggle is specifically, but I think overall, my advice would be to trust yourself, and that who you're attracted to and how you're attracted to them is yours and yours alone, and you are the one that gets to determine the language you use and the language you claim. There's
Hmm.
no, and we joke about this in the group, like, I'm not like the bi fairy that like comes and like deems you as being bi enough. Like, you get to determine that for yourself. And I think trusting yourself to know that you know who you are,
Hmm.
and whether or not you can share that with other people, and how many people you choose to let in to that reality, is also your choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. And I love what you said about that you get to choose the language, because I think that how we speak to ourselves just holds so much more power than we would like to think that it does. And
Yes.
even just shifting your language and kind of like admitting that to yourself, like, that you can share with people if you want to, of course, whatever you feel comfortable with, and whatever is going to keep you safe also.
Hmm.
But who has to know if you don't want to share that or aren't able to, that I think being honest with yourself and using the language that feels good is just as good.
Yeah.
And that like we just put so much immense pressure on ourselves to be enough, whether it's queer enough, or am I a good enough mother or daughter or friend and or content creator.
Yes.
That like we're always kind of setting ourselves up for comparison. And so, really honoring that experience. It's great to hear you say that as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Do you want to wrap up with maybe some ways that kind of affirm your queer identity? Like how maybe some things that you feel represent you, or some ways that you like to engage with queer media that feel good and kind of affirm your identity?
Sure. Um, I think it's so important to remember that queerness is not only one's actions, and certainly not one's sexual actions. And this, I'm veering off from the question you just asked me, but part of what I think is so important about the work that you're doing is reminding people of our history, right? And sometimes I worry that there are people who've joined the page and are like, "Yay, I'm bi now." And I'm like, "Okay, great. And I'd love for you to learn more about what that means, and the history of that movement, and that we've been here the whole time." Um, and so that, I think, deepening your knowledge around history can be a really great way to connect with your queerness and feel a sense of like, I have ancestors that were queer or engaged in the movement. So that's one way. I think if you can get involved with queer community, whether that's in person or online, that can always feel affirming. Well, I guess it doesn't always. Sometimes it's not, but hopefully you find one that is,
Right.
and you're always welcome with us. But that, I think, also read, a lot of our community likes to read books. Some of them are like young adult novels, which I had never felt drawn to, but have really witnessed how important that's been for some people to get to kind of live vicariously through those characters, and kind of have some of those early experiences that maybe they missed out on, right? Of like
Mhm.
nervously holding hands with another girl, if that's something you've never gotten to do, like reading about it can feel really special and connected to that. Um, and yeah, I think there's tons of great queer media to engage with, and that's growing rapidly now. It feels so different than like when I was in high school and didn't even understand that like being bi was really an option because there was no representation, or the representation that there was really negative.
'Cause we had Tila Tequila now.
Right. Right. Yeah. I was going to say, how old, do you mind if I ask how old you are?
Oh, I'm 31.
Okay. Yeah. So like even, for folks who are 10 years younger, it's such a different experience.
Yeah, the 2000s were like the Wild West.
Wild West. And it was just like, oh, well, I don't want to use that word because I don't want people to think I'm just doing this for attention, or I'm just like wanting to kiss girls at parties to like please guys. Like this
Thanks,
is
Katy Perry.
thanks, right, and like has nothing to do with the male gaze. Thank you very much. But yeah, it's evolved.
It
So
definitely
thank
has.
goodness for that. And yeah, I think for some people, like dressing certain ways or like just embracing that reality can be really healing. So I hope folks feel some freedom to explore and get curious about the various parts of themselves, because there's so much joy and possibility when you allow yourself that freedom.
Yes, we are officially giving you permission to cuff your
Yes.
sleeves and your pants, order
Stop it
yourself an
all.
iced coffee,
Yes.
swirl it around, because iced coffee is practically a food group.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, and I love what you said about the history, because honestly, like, I was doing consulting and I found that lots of teachers didn't know LGBTQ plus history. It wasn't that they didn't want to teach it, but
Mhm.
they didn't know it. And I was like, me too, girl.
Right.
But because it has been systematically erased on purpose. And so by combating that erasure and really just like learning your roots and knowing the history and our queer ancestors and transcestors
Mhm.
that have come before us, it's been really great being able to share that through the podcast. So I'm so
Yeah,
grateful that you've been along for the journey for the podcast
absolutely.
as well. And so thank you so much for being on. Do you want to let folks know where they can find you?
Absolutely. So, you can find me in a number of places. But if you're interested in the Bi Invisibility community, our Instagram is bi_invisibility. And from that page, you can make your way to my website and our Patreon and get connected that way. And definitely keep an eye out in the new year. I plan on doing a kind of welcome and like reflecting on identity and your wishes for the new year. So there's a free event coming. So definitely follow the page so you don't miss it.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being on. And thank you all for listening. This has been Rebecca Miner from Bi Invisibility, and we will see you the next time. Thanks so much for making it to the end of the episode. If you like this content, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. All of that stuff really helps out the channel. And if you are able to do so, we do have a Patreon page where you can help support the podcast and help me to tell more of these stories that have been hidden from us and to share our collective history. Thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.